Greetings. Today we bring you three terrifying tales revolving around a very old antique store and the interesting items it has in store for you. Enjoy. Story 1. Reflections.
Emily had always been drawn to the strange and unusual. As an artist, she sought inspiration in the forgotten relics of the past, finding beauty in the cracks and imperfections of old things. So when she stumbled upon a small, dimly lit antique store tucked away in a narrow alley on a rainy afternoon, she felt an irresistible pull to step inside. The bell above the door jingled softly as Emily entered, and she was immediately enveloped in the scent of aged wood and dust. The shop was a labyrinth of old furniture, dusty books, and peculiar trinkets. It was as though she had stepped back in time into a world where every item had a story to tell. As she wandered through the narrow aisles, her eyes fell upon a large, ornate mirror tucked away in the corner of the shop. The mirror was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its frame was made of dark, intricately carved wood, twisting and curling like the roots of an ancient tree. The glass itself was flawless, reflecting the dim light of the store with an almost unnatural clarity. Yet, despite its beauty, there was something unsettling about the mirror, something that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand on end. "Ah, I see you found the mirror," came a voice from behind her. Emily turned to see an elderly man standing behind her. He was the shop's owner, Mr. Carson. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, filled with a knowledge that seemed to go beyond his years. "It's beautiful," Emily said, unable to tear her eyes away from the mirror. "Indeed it is," Mr. Carson replied, stepping closer. "It's a very special piece with a long and interesting history." Emily's curiosity was piqued. What kind of history? Mr. Carson's smile widened, though there was something in his expression that made Emily uneasy. "That mirror has been around for centuries. It's said to be cursed, you know. They say that those who gaze into it for too long can see things that aren't really there, and sometimes those things can see them back." Emily chuckled, trying to brush off the feeling of unease that was creeping up on her. "Sounds like the stuff of ghost stories." "Perhaps," Mr. Carson said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "But every story has a kernel of truth, don't you think?" Despite his warning, Emily found herself captivated by the mirror. There was something about it that drew her in, something that whispered to her in a voice she couldn't quite hear. Without thinking much further, she made up her mind. "I'll take it," she said, not entirely sure why she felt such a compulsion. Mr. Carson's expression was unreadable as he nodded. "Very well, but remember, miss, be careful with that mirror. It has a way of revealing things best left unseen." Emily paid for the mirror and arranged for it to be delivered to her home. As she left the shop, Mr. Carson watched her go with a look of quiet resignation, as though he had seen this scenario play out before. The mirror arrived at Emily's apartment the next day. She wasted no time setting it up in her studio, placing it in the perfect spot where the natural light from the large windows would catch the intricate details of its frame. In the daylight, the mirror seemed to glow, its dark wood contrasting beautifully with the bright, airy room. Emily stood in front of the mirror, admiring her reflection. For a moment, she thought she saw something move behind her in the glass, a shadow or a flicker of light, but when she turned around, there was nothing there. She shook off the feeling and began to work, using the mirror as inspiration for her latest series of paintings. As the days passed, Emily found herself spending more and more time in front of the mirror. It became a ritual of sorts. Each morning she would stand before it, staring into its depths as though searching for something hidden within the glass. The more she looked, the more she began to see things, fleeting images that flickered just out of sight. Shadows moved behind her reflection, faces appeared for a split second before vanishing, and the air around the mirror seemed to grow colder. At first, Emily convinced herself that it was just her imagination. After all, she was an artist with an overactive mind, prone to seeing patterns and images where there were none. But the visions grew more frequent and more vivid. She began to dream of the mirror, dark, terrible dreams where she was trapped inside it, unable to escape. One evening, her best friend Sophie came to visit. As soon as Sophie entered the studio, she noticed the change in her friend. Emily looked pale and tired, her eyes sunken with dark circles beneath them. "Emily, are you okay?" Sophie asked, her concern evident in her voice. "I'm fine," Emily replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just been working a lot." Sophie's gaze fell on the mirror. It stood ominously in the corner, its surface gleaming in the dim light. There was something about it that made Sophie uneasy, a dark energy that seemed to emanate from the glass. "Is that new?" Sophie asked, nodding toward the mirror. Emily nodded. "Isn't it beautiful? I found it at this little antique shop. The owner said it's cursed." Sophie frowned. "Cursed? That's not funny, Emily." I know, Emily said, waving a hand dismissively. "But it's just a story. I've been seeing some weird things, though, probably just my mind playing tricks on me." Sophie didn't like the sound of that. She could sense a dark presence in the room, something that felt wrong on a deep primal level. "Emily, you should be careful. I've read about objects like this. Sometimes they really do have something attached to them." Emily laughed, though there was a nervous edge to her voice. "Don't worry, Sophie. I'm not going to let a mirror scare me." But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The mirror gave her the creeps, and she could sense its influence on Emily. As she left the studio, she made a mental note to check on her friend more often. As the weeks went by, Emily's obsession with the mirror deepened. She spent hours staring into it, watching the images that flickered in the glass. The visions became more disturbing, twisted faces, dark figures, and scenes of violence and death. She began to hear whispers, soft and unintelligible at first, but growing louder and more insistent. The whispers called her name, beckoning her closer to the mirror. They spoke of hidden truths, of secrets buried deep within her soul. They promised her power, beauty, and immortality, if only she would give herself to the mirror. Emily tried to resist, but the mirror's pull was too strong. She found herself standing in front of it late at night, unable to look away. The whispers filled her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. She began to see herself in the mirror, but it was not her. This reflection was different, darker, with eyes that gleamed with malice. One night, the whispers grew louder than ever, demanding that she step into the mirror. Emily felt an overwhelming urge to obey, to reach out and touch the glass. Her reflection smiled, a twisted, mocking smile that sent a chill down her spine. "No," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't real." But the reflection's smile only widened. "It's real, Emily. You know it is. You belong to me now." With a cry, Emily backed away from the mirror, but she was too late. The glass rippled like water, and her reflection stepped out of the mirror, a dark doppelganger that was a twisted version of herself. Emily tried to run, but the doppelganger grabbed her, its hands cold as ice. The room spun around her, and she felt herself being pulled into the mirror. The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was her own face, twisted in terror as her reflection dragged her into the abyss. Days passed, and no one heard from Emily. Sophie, growing increasingly worried, decided to visit her friend. When she arrived at the studio, she found the door unlocked and the lights off. The room was cold and dark, and the air was thick with an oppressive sense of dread. "Emily?" Sophie called out, but there was no answer. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The first thing she noticed was the mirror standing in the center of the room. It was cracked, the glass splintered like a spider's web. Sophie approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stared into the mirror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Emily's face stared back at her from within the glass, but it was twisted and distorted, as though she were trapped on the other side. Her eyes were wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. Sophie gasped and stumbled back, her mind reeling. She knew in that moment that Emily was gone, that the mirror had claimed her, just as Mr. Carson had warned. Sophie turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her. The mirror's surface began to ripple, and the room filled with the sound of whispers, soft, insistent, and filled with malice. With a sinking feeling, Sophie realized that she too was trapped. The mirror had claimed another victim, and there was no escape. Whispers grew louder. Sophie felt the room closing in around her. The once familiar studio now felt alien, as if the walls themselves were tightening, forcing her toward the cursed mirror that loomed ominously in the center of the room. She backed away slowly, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to find a way out. Any way out that didn't involve looking into the mirror's fractured surface. But the whispers persisted, their soft cadence weaving through her thoughts, planting seeds of doubt and fear. "Sophie, come closer," they murmured, each word pulling her further into their thrall. She tried to resist, but her legs moved of their own accord, step by agonizing step, until she found herself standing directly in front of the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, wide-eyed, trembling with terror. But there was something else, a shadowy figure lingering just behind her in the reflection, watching with eyes that glowed with a malevolent light. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to avert her gaze, but the pull of the mirror was too strong. The shadowy figure stepped closer, its outline growing sharper as it approached. It was Emily, or rather, what Emily had become. Her face was twisted into a grotesque parody of itself, her features contorted with pain and fear. Her once bright eyes were now dark voids, reflecting nothing but the abyss from which she had come. "Sophie," the twisted reflection whispered, her voice echoing within the confines of Sophie's mind. "Help me." But there was no helping her now. Sophie knew that whatever remained of her friend was gone, consumed by the dark entity that had taken her place. Yet despite the horror she felt, she couldn't look away. The mirror's pull was too powerful, its dark magic too enticing. Without warning, the glass of the mirror began to ripple again, and Sophie's reflection started to distort, her features warping into something unrecognizable. The reflection smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin that did not belong to her. Sophie could feel her mind unraveling, the whispers driving her to the brink of madness. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." But it was real, and the mirror was relentless. The reflection's grin widened, and Sophie felt herself being drawn into the glass. The room around her seemed to blur and fade, and the mirror's cold surface began to envelop her, pulling her into its dark depths. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Sophie reached out, trying to grasp onto anything solid, anything to anchor herself to reality. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the mirror's frame, and for a brief moment she thought she might pull herself back. But the mirror had other plans. With a sudden, violent jerk, the mirror yanked her in, swallowing her whole. The last thing Sophie saw was her own reflection, twisted into something monstrous, as the glass closed around her, sealing her fate. And then there was nothing but darkness.
So ends our first story. Story 2, The Cursed Music Box.
Emily wasn't the only one who found herself drawn to Mr. Carson's antique store. In a different corner of town, there was John, a man in his early 30s with a passion for collecting rare and unusual artifacts. He'd always had a keen interest in history, particularly in items that carried with them a sense of mystery and the unknown. So, when he heard about a little antique store tucked away in a narrow alley, he decided to pay it a visit. The store, dimly lit and filled with the scent of dust and aged wood, was like a treasure trove of forgotten relics. As John wandered through the aisles, his eyes caught sight of a small, ornate music box sitting on a high shelf. The box was beautifully crafted, its dark wood inlaid with delicate gold filigree. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and John knew immediately that this was a piece with a story. He carefully lifted the box down from the shelf, running his fingers over the intricate carvings. There was something about it that felt different, as if it was more than just a simple music box. He turned the small key on the side, and the lid slowly opened with a soft creak. A haunting melody began to play, a tune that was both beautiful and eerie. The music filled the small space around him, echoing off the walls of the shop. It was unlike any melody John had ever heard, and he found himself entranced by its haunting notes. "Ah, you found the music box?" came Mr. Carson's voice from behind him. John turned to see the elderly shopkeeper standing there, watching him with those sharp, knowing eyes. "It's incredible," John said, still listening to the melody. "How much for it?" Mr. Carson hesitated, his gaze lingering on the music box. "That piece has a long history," he said slowly, "and not all of it is pleasant. They say the box is cursed." Cursed, John repeated, raising an eyebrow. How so? There's a legend, Mr. Carson explained, his voice dropping to a whisper. They say that the melody it plays is a call to spirits, those who have passed on, but cannot rest. The box was made by a man who lost his wife in a terrible accident. He was so grief-stricken that he turned to dark magic to try to bring her back. But instead of reuniting with his beloved, he trapped her spirit in the box, along with others. Now, when the music plays, it calls to the restless souls, and they come to claim whoever listens too long. John listened to the story with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. He had heard tales like this before, and while he didn't necessarily believe in curses, there was something about the music box that intrigued him. I'll take it, he said, his curiosity getting the better of him. Mr. Carson nodded, though there was a look of concern in his eyes. Be careful with it, he warned. There are some things that should not be disturbed. John dismissed the warning with a smile, but as he left the shop with the music box in hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the box than met the eye. That evening, John placed the music box on a shelf in his study, where he kept all his prized artifacts. He couldn't resist winding it up once more, letting the haunting melody fill the room. The music was mesmerizing, and as he listened, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. But as the melody played, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The warm, cozy atmosphere of the study grew cold, and John felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the flickering shadows cast by the lamplight. The music continued to play, its notes growing softer and more distant, as if they were coming from somewhere far away. John shook his head, trying to dispel the unease that was creeping up in him. It was just a music box, after all. There was no such thing as a curse. But as the last note of the melody faded into silence, John heard something that made his blood run cold, a faint, echoing whisper just on the edge of hearing. He froze, straining to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. He shook off the feeling, convincing himself that it was just his imagination. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences began to multiply. Every time John wound up the music box, he would hear the whispers again, growing louder and more insistent. The air around the box would grow cold, and he began to see fleeting shadows out of the corner of his eye. At first, he tried to ignore it, but the whispers followed him even when the box wasn't playing. They grew louder at night when the house was dark and quiet, filling his mind with voices he couldn't understand. The shadows, too, became more pronounced, dark figures that lingered just out of sight, vanishing when he turned to look. One night, as he lay in bed trying to sleep, the whispers grew so loud that they seemed to echo through the entire house. They were no longer unintelligible. He could hear them clearly now, voices calling his name, begging for release, cursing him for disturbing their rest. Terrified, John got out of bed and went to the study, where the music box sat on the shelf. He picked it up, intending to lock it away somewhere it couldn't be heard. But as he held it, the box began to play on its own, the lid slowly creaking open as the haunting melody filled the room. The whispers intensified, rising to a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every corner of the room. John could see the shadows now, dark, twisted shapes that moved closer with every passing second. He tried to cover his ears, but the voices were inside his head, relentless and unforgiving. In a panic, John grabbed the music box and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a resounding crash, the wood splintering as it fell to the floor. For a moment, the voices stopped and the room fell silent. But then a cold wind swept through the study, extinguishing the flames of the candles. The room was plunged into darkness, and in the shadows, John saw them. Dozens of ghostly figures, their faces twisted in pain and anger, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They moved toward him, their whispers turning into screams as they closed in. John backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was nowhere to run. The spirits surrounded him, their cold hands reaching out, dragging him into the darkness. The next morning, John's house was eerily silent. When his friends came looking for him, they found the front door ajar and the house empty. The study was in disarray, the furniture overturned, and the walls marked with deep scratches. But of John, there was no sign. He had vanished without a trace. The only thing left behind was the shattered remains of the music box, lying in the center of the room. The once beautiful artifact was now broken beyond repair, its haunting melody silenced forever. But the whispers remained. Over the years, the house gained a reputation for being haunted. Those who entered would hear faint whispers, feel sudden drops in temperature, and see shadows moving in the corners of their vision. The legend of the cursed music box grew, and many believed that the spirits of those trapped within it were still searching for peace, doomed to wander the earth until they could find release. And so, the music box remains, a relic of a dark past that should never have been disturbed. A warning to those who seek out the strange and unusual. Some things are better left forgotten.
Now for our final story, Story 3, The Phantom Painting.
Lily was a young artist known for her ability to capture emotions and atmosphere in her work. She had a particular fondness for painting landscapes, often drawing inspiration from the natural world around her. But recently, she had found herself in a creative slump, unable to find the spark that once drove her passion. One day, while wandering through the city in search of inspiration, Lily stumbled upon a quaint little antique store hidden away in an alley she had never noticed before. The storefront was unassuming, with a single sign that read, "Carson's Antiques," hanging above the door. Curious, Lily pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and dust. The store was filled with all manner of objects, old furniture, tarnished silverware, and shelves lined with books whose spines were cracked with age. But what caught her eye was a large framed painting leaning against the far wall. The painting depicted a dark, foreboding forest. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The forest floor was shrouded in mist, and in the distance, barely visible through the gloom, was the faint outline of a figure standing among the trees. The painting was hauntingly beautiful, with an atmosphere so vivid that Lily felt as though she could step right into the scene. The colours were muted, the brushstrokes precise yet filled with emotion. There was something about the painting that spoke to her on a deep, almost primal level. As she stared at it, she felt a chill run down her spine. The longer she looked, the more the painting seemed to draw her in, as though it was alive, beckoning her to come closer. "Quite the piece, isn't it?" Lily jumped, startled by the sudden voice. She turned to see an elderly man standing behind her, his presence as quiet and unsettling as the painting itself. He was the shop's owner, Mr. Carson, and his eyes gleamed with a knowledge that seemed to stretch far beyond the years he had lived. "It's incredible," Lily managed to say, tearing her gaze away from the painting to look at him. "It feels so real." Mr. Carson nodded, his expression unreadable. The artist was exceptionally talented. They say he poured his very soul into his work. That painting in particular has a rather dark history. "What do you mean?" Lily asked, her curiosity piqued despite the lingering unease she felt. Mr. Carson hesitated for a moment before continuing. "The painting was created by a reclusive artist who lived deep in the woods, far from civilization. He was known for his landscapes, particularly his depictions of forests. But as time went on, his work grew darker, more disturbing. Some say the forest in this painting is the very one where he lost his mind." Lily shivered, both intrigued and unnerved. Lost his mind? How? "The artist disappeared shortly after completing this piece," Mr. Carson explained. "No one knows what happened to him, but there are those who believe that the forest he painted wasn't just a place. It was a doorway, a portal to something beyond our understanding. They say that those who gaze into the painting for too long become lost within it, just as the artist did." Lily frowned, trying to process the strange story. "That sounds like a legend, something people say to make the painting more interesting." "Perhaps," Mr. Carson said with a small smile. "But legends often have a grain of truth in them. I would advise you to be careful with this piece, miss. It's not just a painting, it's a gateway." Despite the ominous warning, Lily felt a deep connection to the painting. It was as though it was calling to her, offering her the inspiration she had been searching for. She decided to take it home, convinced that it would help her break free from her creative block. As she left the store with the painting carefully wrapped and tucked under her arm, Mr. Carson watched her go with a look of quiet resignation, as though he knew what fate awaited her. Lily hung the painting in her studio, where it dominated the room with its dark beauty. Every time she looked at it, she felt a strange pull, an urge to paint something similar, something that captured the same sense of foreboding and mystery. She began working on a new series inspired by the painting, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't quite capture the essence of the forest. As the days turned into weeks, Lily found herself spending more and more time staring at the painting, lost in its depths. She would stand in front of it for hours, her eyes tracing the twisted branches, the shrouded figure in the distance. The more she looked, the more the painting seemed to change, as though it was alive and shifting before her very eyes. At first, the changes were subtle. A branch that seemed to bend differently, a shadow that grew darker. But as time went on, the alterations became more pronounced. The mist in the painting thickened, the trees seemed to close in, and the figure in the distance began to move closer. Lily tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The painting was no longer just an object. It was something more, something that was slowly consuming her. Her dreams, too, were filled with visions of the forest. She would find herself wandering through the trees, the mist curling around her like cold fingers. The figure in the distance would always be there, watching, waiting. She could never get close enough to see its face, but she could feel its presence, dark and oppressive, as it guided her deeper into the woods. The more time she spent with the painting, the more detached Lily became from reality. Her friends noticed the change in her, how she had grown pale and withdrawn, her once vibrant personality fading like the dying light at the edge of the forest. They tried to reach out to her, but Lily pushed them away, consumed by her obsession with the painting. One evening, as she stood in front of the painting once more, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The figure in the distance was now much closer, almost at the edge of the forest. But that wasn't what frightened her. It was the figure's face. It was her own. Lily stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. How was this possible? She blinked, hoping the image would change, but it didn't. The figure in the painting was her, standing alone in the dark, twisted forest. Panic set in as she realized the full extent of what was happening. The painting wasn't just a piece of art, it was a trap, a doorway to a place where she didn't belong. And now it was too late to escape. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. The fear gnawed at her, and she kept seeing the painting in her mind's eye, the twisted trees, the mist, and her own face staring back at her. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know what. The painting had a hold on her, and she didn't know if she could break free. In a desperate attempt to reclaim her life, Lily decided to destroy the painting. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen and returned to the studio, determined to cut the canvas to shreds. But as she approached the painting, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the lights flickered. The painting seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it was alive. The trees in the painting twisted and writhed, and the mist began to spill out of the canvas, filling the room with a thick, choking fog. Lily tried to move, to tear the painting from the wall, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. The figure in the painting, her figure, stared back at her with hollow eyes, and Lily could feel the forest closing in around her, its twisted branches reaching out to pull her in. "No!" Lily screamed, trying to fight against the invisible force that was dragging her toward the painting. But it was no use. The mist enveloped her, and the world around her began to fade. She could feel herself being pulled into the canvas, the dark forest swallowing her whole. The last thing she saw before she disappeared into the painting was her own terrified reflection in the glass, distorted and twisted, just like the trees that now surrounded her. The next day, when her friends came to check on her, they found the studio empty. The painting was still there, hanging on the wall, but Lily was nowhere to be found. They searched the entire apartment, but there was no trace of her. As they stood in front of the painting, one of them noticed something strange. The figure in the distance, the one that had always been shrouded in mist, was now clearly visible. It was Lily, standing in the middle of the forest, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The friends stared in horror, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. They knew deep down that Lily was gone, trapped within the painting just as the artist had been before her. They left the studio in a daze, unable to explain what had happened. The painting remained, its dark, twisted beauty untouched. But now there were two figures in the forest, and the mist seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. The painting eventually found its way back to Mr. Carson's antique store, where it was placed in the darkest corner of the shop, hidden away from prying eyes. But the legend of the phantom painting grew, and those who dared to seek it out often found themselves drawn to it, just as Lily had been. And so the cycle continued, as the painting claimed more and more souls, trapping them in the dark forest where they would wander for eternity, lost and forgotten. For those who stumble upon the painting, beware. It is not just a piece of art, it is a gateway, a portal to a place where no one should ever go. And once you are lost within its depths, there is no escape.
Thank you for joining us on this eerie journey through the unknown. Remember, the next time you find yourself in an antique store surrounded by items that seem too beautiful, too perfect, or too unique, think twice before taking them home. You never know what dark secrets they might hold. Please take the time to like and subscribe if you have not had the opportunity yet. Also, we are putting out 3 daily short videos: serial killer quotes, dark days in history, and morbid riddles. Make sure to check them out and hit the notifications so you can be alerted each day. Have a good evening.